Vectors are animals that are capable of carrying disease pathogens from a reservoir, an animal, a human, or an environment, to another host. They are a major cause of sickness and death in many humanitarian contexts. In addition to transmitting diseases, some vector may also be considered as a nuisance because of the painful bite or due to the large number. The objectives of this lecture is for you to understand the transmission mechanism of diseases through vectors. Know the main vectors commonly encountered in emergencies and their related diseases. Understand the outlines of vector control strategies. A vector carries and transmits infectious pathogens from a reservoir to another host. The reservoir can be an animal or a human or the environment on which an infectious agent depends to survive. The pathogen can be transmitted mechanically to another host. It means that the vector transmits the pathogen by transporting them on its body. Let's take an example. A fly landing on faces with pathogens will then transmit this pathogen to the human by landing on its side or in the salad that the person is eating. The pathogen can also be transmitted after biological transformation. In that case, the vector is involved in the life cycle of the pathogen which mature through the vector, such as the malaria. In the transmission of vector-borne diseases, infection can occur via biting, which, for instance, the malaria-transmitting mosquitoes, or via skin penetration, for instance, for the scabies-transmitting mites, or ingestion, food contamination by flies, for instance. In humanitarian context, displaced populations are particularly at risk of vector-transmitted diseases. Indeed, the stress, the lack of good nutrition, and lack of previous exposure to diseases are factors affecting a population's immunity to vector-borne diseases. Overcrowding makes it easier for some vectors to spread diseases from person to person. This is particularly the case, for instance, for lice and mites. Poor housing increases as well the risk to vector exposure. And poor drainage, poor solid waste, or poor sanitation management increase the risk of having vectors. The area that hosts displaced population can also be an area that supports a significant vector population. And protracted conflicts can also affect the capacity of authorities to carry out traditional vector control measures that used to be done in the past. In order to minimize morbidity and mortality due to vector-borne diseases, vector control measures should be taken in epidemic zone, in epidemic-prone contexts, or wherever there is a high presence of the vector. Vector control strategies usually aim at reducing vector breeding sites, reducing vector population density, or in order to reduce the risk of human-vector contact. In other words, reducing the creation of the hazard, its transport, and the exposure of people to the hazard. The vector control strategies may be classified in 4 types. Environmental control, in order to alter breeding sites, such as draining or filling sites, or also ensuring a proper waste management. There is also the mechanical control, for instance, using nets against mosquitoes, covering food against flies, or using traps to catch rodents. The biological management, which consists of using living organisms or products against the different form of the vector. A typical example is the use of fish that eat larvae, for instance. Finally, the chemical control for personal protection, such as sprays used as a mosquito repellent, or insecticides for environmental control. However, it is usually recommended to use insecticides at the last resort. Indeed, it is much more efficient and effective and less costly to collect and remove refuse regularly than to depend upon insecticides to combat flies or rat poison to limit rodents. In addition, while using pesticides, it is very important to ensure that the staff, the communities, and the local environment are adequately protected. And of course, avoid that creating chemical resistance to the substance used. In summary, in order to take effective actions against the vector, it is crucial to be familiar with the vector life and its habitat. The following table lists some common vectors or diseases encountered in humanitarian contexts. Mosquitoes, with 3 main species responsible for transmitting diseases. The Anophel, which breed in rather unpolluted water such as puddles or wells and which transmit malaria. The Aedes, which tend to breed in water receptacles such as bottles or buckets and which transmit yellow fever and dengue. The Culex, which breed in stagnant water loaded with organic matter such as in latrines and transmit filariasis. Flies proliferate in all places where human beings are living. They feed on decomposing organic matter, excreta and food. They play an important role in the transmission of diarrheal disease. Action against houseflies include limit or eliminate breeding sites, typically collect refuse, improve compost heaps, protect latrines, improve drainage. In addition, sources of attraction should be reduced and food well protected with lids. Lice are found on hair and clothing. They can transmit typhus, which is fatal to 10 to 40% of untreated patients, as well as relapsing fever. Action against lice include improving general hygiene, wash clothing and blankets, and treating all people with an insecticide powder. Fleas feed on the blood of mammals and birds. They are found in beds, in the ground, and in clothing. The rat flea is responsible for bubonic plague and murine typhus. Bedbugs do not transmit any diseases, but they nevertheless constitute a considerable nuisance because they feed on blood. They hide in cracks in walls or wood, and also in bedding. Insecticide is required to eliminate them. As we have seen, vector-controlled diseases are a major cause of sickness and death in many humanitarian crises where populations are particularly at risk. In order to reduce the transmission of these specific diseases, it is very important to know the life cycle of vectors and its habitats in order to take effective measures at the right time and at the right place. For instance, if body lice, the vector of typhus, are to be eliminated, they have to be attacked on the body or on the clothing. It is pointless to spray surfaces with residual insecticide. But on the other hand, to control bed bugs and other crawling insects such as cockroaches and flies, spraying walls, the furniture, and the floor is an effective measure because these insects rest on such surfaces after feeding. However, remember that the use of chemicals to control vectors is not necessarily the best option. Mechanical, environmental, or biology measures may be much more appropriate and efficient. So, in order to design a proper vector control measure, a detailed study on the vector and often expert advice are needed and should be sought from national and international health organizations. Let's have a look now at a concrete example. In the next video, we will see the control campaign carried out by the ICRC in Madagascar prisons in collaboration with local authorities and the Pasteur Institute.